Hey everybody, welcome back to Eggs. Today's special guest is founder of Startup Junkie Consulting and the Startup Junkies podcast. His name is Jeff Amarine. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Ryan. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. I'm thrilled to death to have you here. Just in doing a little bit of research about you and where you come from and, sort of your background, it's very interesting to me. I'm living in Salt Lake City now, but I come from a small part of Southeast Idaho called Pocatello. Mm-hmm. And Idaho, much like your home base of Arkansas, is kind of one of those flyover places that sort of gets forgotten. And I was listening to a talk you were giving, a TED Talk, and you were just talking about sort of the Sam Walton and Walmart startup and how they sort of decided to go to these little towns and stuff. And I remember when the Walmart first came to Pocatello. And, at that time, the concept of startups and, new business ventures and stuff like that, especially for young people, didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And, now I live in Salt Lake City and it's a much more bustling startup community down here, but the culture is kind of odd. And as a guy from a small town, I find it a little bit hard for me to fit in. So I'm really excited to talk to you just about startup culture in general, but also I think we'll have some similarities in sort of small town or I think, as you call them, the flyover state sort of
Absolutely.
Approach. Yeah. So anyway, so let's start maybe a little bit, just, get your background out there. Let's talk about where you come from and how we got here today.
Sure. Well, I'll try to give you kind of a shrink wrap version of the last 61 years. But
feel free to take your time because it really is interesting. And some of the experiences you've got in particular, I think really lend to the person you became. Right?
For sure.
So I think it's important to cover that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And again, thanks for having me on. But I didn't come to entrepreneurship as, waking up as an 18-year-old thinking someday I'm going to start businesses and have my own business. I grew up in a military family. So what that meant was I went to 6 different grade schools. I went to 2 junior highs. Once my dad retired, I did go to just 1 high school, but we were all over the world, literally during the kind of the height of the Cold War. He was a multi-engine pilot in the Air Force. And so I grew up in a way that I think developed a bunch of resilience around having to make friends fairly quickly and realizing that you needed to do that because you might not see them again. And there was a certain element of change and excitement in what's coming next that I think kind of stuck in some ways. And so the family business for me growing up was the military. My dad had been career Air Force. My brother was career Air Force. My sister was an Army officer. My brother-in-law we were all military. This is long and short of. And it turns out upon further research, every generation back to the Revolutionary War had served in some capacity. So it was something that maybe is epigenetic. I don't know. But that was kind of my universe. And then my dad retired. That took us to north central Arkansas, which was the smallest of small town. After being kind of a cosmopolitan kid who had lived all over the world and all over the country, we settled in a place of 7,000 people in a county of less than 20,000 people that was rural and cliquish, and everybody had known everybody since conception in that town. It was a really tight community. It was strange being an outsider, and I thought, well, okay, it's learn some things, learn how to do some farm work and haul hay and take care of cows and rotor-till gardens. But I ended up leaving thinking I would never come back. In 1980, I went to the Naval Academy, starting my own military career. Spent 4 years there, had a great time in Annapolis, Maryland, then took my commission in the Air Force and spent 6.5 years in the Air Force thinking initially that was going to be a career for me. I would be a 30-year guy, et cetera. Along the way, it turns out I didn't have good enough eyesight to fly, and I'd always dreamed about flying. I got injured in the Special Forces pipeline about halfway through my career. I spent the last 2.5 years in research and development and in program management, which was really kind of an on-ramp to industry. And I left out the part that I was intercontinental ballistic missile launch officer during the Cold War for 4 years and 165 days underground convinced me that I needed something a little more active, even though it was a really important job and way more responsibility and accountability than a 24-year-old should have with billion-dollar systems and nuclear weapons, et cetera. But anyhow, that was the on-ramp to the commercial world. I spent after that back in Annapolis, Maryland, Baltimore, Maryland area. I was with Westinghouse Electric. We built satellite systems, both commercial and defense-oriented. Got a lot of worldwide product management, business development experience. And I falsely began to believe that I could run my own business based on that time that I spent at Westinghouse. And then for the next bunch of years, launched a number of tech or telecom related businesses. Some worked, some didn't work. I ran an international FCC licensed telecom carrier in the precursor days of voice over IP. Did some pioneering work between here and Asia on that with my team. A bunch of different things related to telecom and software, and so much so that I think the total number of startups is 9 over a long career. 9 that I would admit to. There may have been some others in there that I wouldn't admit to, but learned a bunch along the way. And those were in kind of the ugly old days in the 90s and early 2000s, before there were really organized angel groups. There wasn't really mentoring. No one knew what an accelerator was. There was no Y Combinator. This was, you're an idiot. You left a great job. You wanted to start something. You figure it out, and good luck. There really wasn't any kind of a startup infrastructure support system. I always happened to be on the East Coast for a lot of that. There wasn't anything like what was developing in Silicon Valley at that time. It was still a lot of conventional business people back there. But I learned a bunch of things along the way. Every mistake you could make as a startup founder, I made more than one time in some instances. Spending money on the wrong things, focusing on the wrong markets, hiring the wrong people. That process of maturation is what has led me to what I've done in more recent years. And so when I left the East Coast to move back to be closer to my folks, that's what brought me to Arkansas. And we actually worked for American Freightways, which was a large, less than truckload carrier, rapidly growing, fastest growing in the country between 1982 and 2000. And when I joined, they had just been acquired by FedEx, became FedEx Freight. And it was an interesting transition to go from being an entrepreneur who had spent some time in big companies to being back in a big company that was initially run like a startup. It was still family controlled. And so we had a lot of ability to look at opportunities, to take risk, and to deploy technology and to dominate the markets we were in. When the FedEx acquisition occurred, all that changed. It was a lot more like working for the government. I mean, the process was slow, a little more bureaucratic. It was a 10x bigger company now in total. And that wasn't a good fit for me. So I ended up leaving, doing one more startup, which was Silicon Valley based. I happened to be based here in Northwest Arkansas. I built the transportation and logistics vertical, learned a bunch of stuff, stayed with that through doing a lift out to one of our partners that was based in New Zealand. And it said, I'm done with this whole startup scene. I've done it. I've been there. I've had some fun. I've learned some things. I checked in at the University of Arkansas and helped run their technology commercialization function for 7 years, and just through happenstance got pulled into teaching new ventures in the Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas. And I thought, oh, this is my terminal job. This is going to be it for the duration. And along the way, it became apparent that the startup scene in Arkansas was not very well developed. There was exactly one early stage fund. There were no entrepreneurial support organizations. There weren't a lot of new ventures getting created. The state saw that. Millikan Institute did a study that said you're going to be dead last in every category you want to measure if you don't do more things that are knowledge and technology based. Your state wage rate is going to stay low. You're just not going to advance as a state. So they kicked off this thing called Innovate Arkansas back in 2007. And it was Winrock International, so Winthrop Rockefeller International, a big NGO that was the prime for the state of Arkansas. The guy who was running it said, we got a couple of former Stevens Bank investment bankers involved with us, but we don't have any operators, people who have made money, raised money, been operators, built companies. And so he said, well, why don't you quit the university and come do this with us? And I said, why don't I not do that? Because I just got here. But maybe I can do this on a part-time basis because it could be accretive to all the stuff I'm doing in tech transfer. And that's the genesis. And this is a little bit of a long-winded wind-up for what became Startup Junkie. It was a completely accidental business with no plan, no lean canvas, no customer discovery that I kind of got sucked into just because of what I had done in the preceding 20-something years. And that was the beginning of what has become an entrepreneurial support organization, the Startup Junkie brand that touches probably 2,000 entrepreneurs a year, puts on about 250 events, has presence in South Korea and Singapore, and is rapidly growing. One of the larger and more successful entrepreneurial support organizations in the central U.S. And it's this weird business model, which would probably be familiar to you, where all of the services are completely free to the entrepreneurs and third-party funded. And the reason why that was important was because I learned that customers with no money are really terrible customers. And that's every small business and entrepreneur you ever met. And yet it's so critical to the economic vitality of the country to have the survival rate for startups improved. And so we essentially sold to the federal government, the state government, and places like the Walton Family Foundation that if you fund us to provide these services, we can show you measurable outcomes that will build this viable venture ecosystem that will have all kinds of tangible benefits. And so we've been at it with this unsustainable business model we've sustained now for 15 years and are continuing to grow along those lines. Along the way, we got involved with writing a book called Creating Startup Junkies, which talked about how to build sustainable venture ecosystems in unexpected places and flyover locations, really anywhere in the country where you don't have a history of it, and launched several venture funds along the way because people ask, well, why'd you do that? It's because no one else was doing it. Somebody had to do it. So we did it and got in that part of the game as well. But that's it. That's kind of from Genesis to current day.
Yeah, I don't know. That's it, man. It really makes that seem much smaller than it is, I think. No, that's an incredible story. And actually, there's a ton of stuff that I want to try and cover. I mean, some of these are recurring themes on this show that we're really trying to get to the root of and figure out how we can help our listenership sort of engage in some of these things. And one of the things I wanted to maybe start about is, well, actually, I just wanted to make a comment too. So I have a small marketing agency, and we have a team in Barcelona, and we've been working really hard to try and develop startup culture and things like that in Spain, because that just doesn't exist over there in the way that it does here. So I'm going to have to check out your book. Maybe there's some collaborative future that we need to look at.
Absolutely. Would love that.
This to foreign countries, because a lot of the team that work for us are a little bit entrepreneurial minded, but the infrastructure doesn't support them. Mm-hmm. And so maybe there's a way to come around on that. So anyway, back to the conversation here. So one of the things I really took an interest in early in your life was you mentioned the term resilience specifically, and it was something that you think you developed as being a person who was a military child and forced to move around, and basically you translated that resilience into being able to build new relationships in each city, or spring back from basically you get comfortable and then it's all stripped away and now you have to start over again. And I think that is a huge factor for startup people, especially, I mean, I can speak from my own experience and being a probably not that successful startup junkie, but a perpetual starter-upper of businesses, meaning I'm constantly starting things, but there's a lot of them that just kind of fizzle and die.
Sure.
But I really enjoy the process of starting these things. And so I end up doing a lot of the starting. But that sort of try and fail mentality, I think, is something that's getting lost on kids that are maybe, coming up now, or maybe a generation or two younger than me, which is, I even look at kids. My oldest son is 17, and I'm looking at people that he goes to school with, and like how devastating it is to fail at something, to the extent that they just won't even try sometimes. It's like they're so unwilling to risk failing that they won't even give it a go. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about developing resilience as a skill or as a trait of your personality, because I think some people are probably born with this, and some people are thrust into it through situations like what you're talking about. But I think to roll this out more broadly to people and really convince them, right? I mean, there's no shortage of Instagram memes that say, sure, fail forward and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, do you have any insights, just maybe from your own experience or from people you've worked with, on how we start to craft maybe a culture of resilience, or a set of characteristics that allow us to be resilient through these kinds of things?
Yeah, it's hard to get that mindset by someone sort of autocratically saying you need to think this way. To some extent, people, I think, need to be led towards it in a way that, and I think there's an element of incrementalism to it. And what I mean by that is, failure is not a fun thing. It's not a good thing. And you want to make the failure small and kind of close together and not necessarily life impacting. I mean, I had some epically large failures in running businesses that were devastating personally. I also had some great successes. And I think some of that built the resilience. The thing that I always worried about were people who had kind of lived the charmed life where they'd never failed at anything, because when they got to that first obstacle, and inevitably you will, where things didn't go right, they don't know how to react. So I think educating young kids that taking risk, qualified risk, taking small risk and building up your confidence along the way, and asking yourself the question, what's the worst thing that can happen? I'm probably not going to die if this business fails or this venture doesn't work or this project doesn't work. Even if I lose a job, if I'm in a big company and I'm taking a risk on something I really believe in, if I'm good in that job, I'm going to be good at the next place as well. And so it's just convincing people to have enough confidence to actually go for it, and to do it in a reasoned way where you're thinking about what's the worst case outcomes that can be associated with this. Some of that I kind of had to do because as a kid, like I said, we were moving around all the time. I was introverted by nature by some of that. So I had to kind of work to get out of that shell of being situationally shy and meeting people and getting involved with stuff. And I still have to, it still kind of takes energy from me, big group settings with a lot of people I don't know, but you kind of push yourself through it. And I think that's where the resilience comes from. It's a matter of just the experience of doing it. And some of it is just that element of confidence that realize, hey, those people that have the capability of doing something big or trying something big, why not me? Why can't I do that as well? And I think as leaders and as educators and as motivators, we have to constantly try to reinforce that, not in sort of this sort of superficial mythological way that often comes from Silicon Valley and elsewhere, but in a very practical way. So you never know. You never know what's going to happen unless you try. So you might as well try. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared. Doesn't mean you shouldn't take qualified risk, but just have the gumption to give it a go and start small. Start small and make it incremental as you go through it.
Yeah, and I think, and I can speak a little bit from my own experience. It sounds like I'm similar to the way you described yourself, which was somewhat introverted and sort of really had to push myself out. And in my earliest days, before I was truly, had a business of my own. I had toyed with it. I'd freelanced on the side. I'd done all this other stuff, but eventually it took a layoff for me to go to work for myself and kind of go, okay, I've landed. Wait a minute. Nothing bad happened. Like, what's going on? Like, it turns out I actually had enough work. What am I doing?
Yep.
And so, but I was, wildly risk averse. I wouldn't have actually taken that step on my own, probably, if I hadn't been shoved out the window, sort of baby bird style. And so for me, it really took that kind of nudge, but I think that nudge doesn't maybe have to be as dire as a layoff. I mean, it could be from a family friend, it could be an opportunity, but that's, I think, why you hear about so many like sort of startup hustler types that are, doing something on the side with the purpose of growing into that position, trying to move their way out of maybe the company they work for, but they're kind of working on the side. It's that hedging, right?
Yeah, it's a super good risk management philosophy. And it's something that's more readily available to do today than maybe ever before, where keep the day job, start the side hustle, even build a virtual team on the side hustle. And when it gets to a point where you've got revenues out in front of expenses or adequate traction, you'll know when the time is right to make that jump. And it's more possible of doing that today than ever before, just because the infrastructure is there, the technical infrastructure. People are comfortable working on remote teams. People are comfortable having kind of a portfolio of activities and engaging with a new start that might be a side hustle. So yeah, I think that the time you're more able to do those sorts of things that were exceedingly difficult early in my career today than ever before.
Yeah, I think that's right. Another sort of aspect of your background that I wanted to talk about, and as somebody who would categorize themselves as being more on the creative side than on the discipline side, not to say they're mutually exclusive, but like I see myself as being a little bit more out here and a little more wild than probably as disciplined as I can be. So I'm always saying, I'm sort of creative first and business guy third, fourth, fifth, sixth,
right.
Somewhere down the line, I do have to do business, but at the end of the rest of my day, I just really want to do creative things. So as a guy with military background, though, obviously there's some forced discipline in there, coming from a military family, you probably had a little bit of family discipline too.
Sure.
And I think that there's a bit of that, kids are probably missing out on generally nowadays. I'm sure there's a whole spectrum, but I think in general, if we're just speaking in sort of generalities or the kinds of things that are attached to, the Gen Xers and the Gen Zers and, all the stuff you hear thrown around, it seems that like general discipline towards business is a struggle for some people, or maybe general discipline towards life is a problem for some of them. So I wanted to talk to you about sort of just the balance of discipline versus creativity, or as I'm calling creativity to mean sort of this, be allowed to just chase your little butterfly around the
Sure.
park. But,
Yeah.
there's sort of a balance that I think needs to be struck there. And I'm wondering if in your experience as somebody who, obviously has a disciplined background, but, has what I would consider sort of a creative streak, which is you're applying your discipline or you're applying your skills in a creative way, even if done in a disciplined way. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about just sort of the value of discipline in your own life, and then maybe how important it is in the young entrepreneur's life.
Yeah. I mean, it's excellent. And a lot of times people assume that a military person's persona is, these are rule followers, these are conformist, these are people that always stay within the lines. And there are those types of folks within the military that if it's not written somewhere and it's in a reg, then that's what they're going to do. There's also a wide number of very successful military people that are always on the edge of breaking a rule, trying something new. There's a famous book written by a guy that's now deceased, who was the original commander of SEAL Team 6, named Richard Marchenko. And he said, when he was in Vietnam, he was one of the first SEAL UDT members. He had this thing where he'd say, unless otherwise directed, and he put it into an acronym. And so you'd go out and take the initiative on things within the rules of engagement, unless otherwise directed by higher headquarters. The reason why U.S. military historically has been successful, and I'd say this is all the way back to the Continental Army, is the ability to have centralized planning and decentralized execution, which requires people on the ground in the moment to be creative in the way they do things. And so my bias was always a little bit towards, I'll follow the rules, I'll show up on time, I'll do what I'm supposed to do. But when I'm not directed otherwise, I'm going to be creative. I'm going to be pushing the edge of the envelope in everything that we do. And I would say I largely applied that in business. And that didn't work especially well in large structured businesses. It actually worked a little better in the military, because a lot of those organizations were all about not wanting you to take chances, not wanting you to take the initiative, wanting you kind of to stay within the line. So I was always a little bit of a rogue cowboy or a rebel in large organizations. So I would say it was, for a lot of former military folks, it was this balance of, yeah, I'm going to do what I have to do to stay out of trouble and to accomplish the mission, but I'm going to take as many liberties as I possibly can to accomplish the mission. And as an entrepreneur, I think that the interesting thing that brought is I wasn't afraid. I'd show up on time. I had the interpersonal skills. I also will say that I'm not particularly good at developing processes. I'm not a point A to point B person. Kind of an inspirational book for me was written by Gino Wickman called Traction. And he talks about two personas, the visionary and the integrator. I realized early on, and it's kind of like you said it, I was good at being a starter, good at the vision. If I was going to build a business that scaled, I needed an integrator that was a good point A to point B person, that was very much in the details and building processes. I think entrepreneurs need to be introspective about what are they really good at. And if they're not really good at that role of integrating and detail and process, they need to have somebody who is, so that they can do what they're best at. So I brought in, it turned out to be my son, who was an Air Force contracting officer. When his final commitment was up and he was thinking of getting out, he wanted to go work for big consulting companies. I said, come help me build this business. And we've been working together now for 10 years because he very much had those skills I didn't, which was point A to point B, process-oriented, details, etc. And so to get back to your original question of discipline versus creativity, I stay on the creative, the vision, the new business side. He does some of that, but he focuses a lot on the details around the discipline of making sure things are getting done on time. And so I think the key there is, you know what you got to do. You show up on time, you got the skills. But the important thing is, if you're not great at that, have somebody on the team who is, that can help actually build a business that scales.
Yeah, I love that as a distinction, because I think there's a lot of people, and, again, I probably project my own experience onto a lot of this stuff. But I mean, I think that there's this feeling among sort of, young founders and people who are trying to go it alone or maybe start their own new business, that the onus is on you to do everything. Right. I mean, there's always these comments about, we have to wear lots of hats and we have to do all this stuff. And to some extent you do. I mean, you can't necessarily start off with a giant team, right? You've got to build a lot of times. And so, but I think this distinction that you're making is right. And I mean, you can even compare it to, I don't know, finding a good partner in life, like whoever you marry, for example.
For sure.
Often you're not marrying somebody who's exactly like you. You're marrying somebody that has a set of characteristics that are different than yours, or somehow better than you, or it fills voids where you don't, or something.
For sure.
And those seem to be the relationships that work best, right? The people who are sort of living in a little echo chamber or whatever, I think eventually you get tired of hearing your own thoughts coming back to you all the time. I think sometimes you got to have somebody challenge you, and especially if you want to grow, whether it's in a relationship personally or in a business relationship, I think it's valuable to hear some feedback and get some pushback every now and then on your ideas. So one of the things that I think, and maybe this isn't right, but I think a lot of people who are young entrepreneurs who are sort of looking for the where to go and how to get started. So maybe this would be the customers that come to you, and you can help me understand if this isn't right. Mm-hmm. But my assumption is that they're coming to a person like you, a consultant or a somebody, in any realm of sort of startup consulting or education or anything like that. And what they're looking for is the way, right? So I think a lot of us have this notion that there's a path that you can follow if you want to be an entrepreneur. And maybe there are some truths along the way that, are going to work across businesses or across whatever's. But I think generally what you discover, and it's certainly what we've found in doing this podcast, across 360 some interviews with different, startup founders and CEOs and things like that, we've discovered that there truly is no way. So you can go and ask, and you can hunt, and you can look and try and find, the way, but there isn't the way. There just is a way. And so, and your way is different. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just how, the startup that might come to an organization like you and, is looking for support and maybe looking for that. How do you help them uncover sort of their way?
Yeah. It's a great question. And this is one of those things that's really confounding, particularly for students. And I teach a lot of undergrad and grad students, and they're expecting it to be this sort of rote, it was written on the tablets type of way. And it isn't. I mean, there's more than one right answer. Now, having said that, there's some really interesting frameworks that have developed over the last 20 years that we're big fans of, that are particularly useful in new venture development, in new product development, and new service development. And they're used from K through 12 all the way through, the Fortune 1 company has bought into a lot of this thinking. And all it really is, if I could summarize, and if Steve Blank or Eric Ries or Ash Moore were on, they would chastise me, but it's really this idea of applying scientific method to validate or invalidate your assumptions about what's going to drive your business. And all that is captured within a variety of different books in the lean startup methodology and in customer discovery. We're pretty big fans of that, quite honestly. We teach that. We believe that. We use some AI-driven tools that have been developed around that philosophy. But all it is exactly what we all learned in the 6th grade. Come up with what the key assumptions are around your business, around what problem you're solving or unmet need, around the customer segments, around the unique value proposition and the benefits of the solution, the cost structure and the revenue structure, and how you're going to measure progress with key metrics and channels, your unfair advantage. Come up with those guesses or those assumptions, and then develop a really good set of open-ended questions. There's a book called Talking to Humans by a guy named Giff Constable, who was at NYU Stern. Ask good open-ended questions that avoid confirmation bias. The fallacy that all of us who are idea generators have is we fall in love with our own ideas. We don't want to hear that our baby's ugly, right? Well, we've kind of put people in the mindset of being a consultant to their own venture that they're trying to create, and try to kill it as many different ways as you can by asking really good questions of customers, subject matter experts, and other, sort of influencers, and really listening to what they say, and then see where those patterns are, something we would call qualitative inquiry, customer development, or customer discovery, and then validate before you build anything if there really is demand for what you're doing. So long story short and all that, there's no one right way to do it. For very early stage, brand new, I've got an idea. I think Lean Canvas and customer discovery is kind of as good a process as has been developed in the last 20 years. And there's a lot that's been written on it. There's a lot of great tools that support it. We're big fans of Ash Moore and Running Lean. And I already mentioned Talking to Humans. But I think those ought to be templates or guides that most startup or small business owners get familiar with.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I think both of those are great resources. I wanted to ask you though, so one of the things you mentioned sort of at the top was that Startup Junkie Consulting was sort of spun out with neither lean canvas or
Yeah.
customer discovery. I mean, maybe innately you understood who the customer might be and some things
Yeah.
like that, but you didn't maybe go through a formal process. And this, I think, goes back to this notion that there isn't necessarily a way to
No.
start a business, right? I mean, there's lots of ways to do this. And so I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about just your experience in spinning up the new business and, basically starting from scratch. I mean, obviously you've come quite some ways. And
Yeah.
then maybe tie that into, I don't know, for the young startup entrepreneur, or young entrepreneur, maybe in a place like, Bentonville used to be, or like Salt Lake used to be, or like
Yeah.
Pocatello, Idaho, where I grew up, where maybe we're looking for, opportunities to start to build a culture around the startup that maybe I want to launch. Maybe
Yeah.
I want to start a company and I need to build a support system.
Yeah.
Can we talk about, how that might happen, or sort of how all those things work together?
Yeah. Yeah. And so the startup junkie experience was such that I knew a lot at that point about conventional business planning, because everything I'd ever built up to that point was you write the 50-page business plan and executive summary that nobody wants to read. You come up with the fictional forecast, which is based on scaling large business assumptions down to a small business. And then you try to go out and get people interested in investing or interested in working with you on it. Everything I'd done up to that point 15 plus years ago was kind of based on that. We started, and so when I launched into Startup Junkie, I was like, oh, this isn't going to be a real business. This is kind of like a fun ad hoc side hustle. I didn't even have an LLC created in the beginning. It was all Schedule C stuff that I was putting on my income taxes in the beginning. And then it was just one of those circumstances where there was such a greenfield here and such interest. And I was one of the few sort of seasoned operators that was available, that stuff started flowing on an inbound basis to say, well, we'd really like to do an accelerator. What do you know about running accelerator? Can we get some federal funding to run accelerator? And I was like, yeah, we can probably do that. And we probably ought to focus on supply chain and retail, because that's what we have locally. And so we got some funding. And the Walton Family Foundation said, what you're doing statewide is great. We need more focus around Northwest Arkansas. Can you help build a series of events? And so we're like, yeah, okay, we'll do an elevator pitch contest. We'll have a little angel forum where people get together. We'll start trying these things, because we had heard from Brad Feld and others, this needs to be entrepreneur led and it needs to be event driven. It's like, okay, I have no idea how to do events. I'd never done any events in my life, but I can probably figure it out. And just a funny aside on that point, one of the first pitch contests we did, we called Gone in 60 Seconds. It was 60-second pitch contest. It was a little bit like Gong Show meets American Idol. And we were so unsophisticated, we were going to do it in a barbecue joint. And we showed up with the projector, which was just going to be a way of sequencing the pitches so we knew who was going to present. Nobody brought a screen. And so we had to snatch one of the tablecloths off the table and hang it on a window. And that was the freaking screen that we used in that first pitch. So needless to say, over 15 years, we've kind of grown into an event management company. But all of that stuff was a sequence of events where we figured out how to say yes to fill gaps that were in the market. And we had the good fortune of there being large organizations that wanted to fund that activity. And they were tolerant in those days that we really didn't know what we were doing, but that we were going to continue to grind our way through to make these sorts of things happen. And so in that instance, would we have been better if we'd been a little more thoughtful, if we'd used a lean canvas approach, if we had understood our customers more? Yeah, we probably would have been a lot better. It probably wouldn't have been as much trial and error, which is why we're big fans of that approach now and doing the customer discovery. So it was a right place, right time, a fair amount of luck associated with it. And the fact that I was just maybe uniquely positioned based on my experience in a lot of other markets to be able to do something like that locally. So I would say, having said that, being able to say yes to things and then grinding my way through to figure things out, doing some things wrong and then quickly getting better. I think it was Guy Kawasaki that famously said, at Apple, we deliver garbage and we make it much better really quickly. So it was that idea of, I'm going to roll out this minimally viable offering, whatever it is, and get better really quickly. And so we were doing things that were very similar to what the lean canvas and what spiral methodology and what Agile says you should do without knowing what to call it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that probably comes a little bit from not having that formality of
Exactly.
program. In Silicon Valley, they probably already had this concept in place.
Yep.
But in a place like where you were coming up or developing this business, that's how
It-
it was. And I think you're
it-
right. Or I mean, I think your story even exemplifies, some of the topics we've talked about, right? This resilience, this willingness to raise your hand, this, being able to push through the fails and
yeah.
I mean, all the way down to just, what seems trivial, using a sheet as a
It-
screen.
exactly.
It's just that trait or that characteristic or that willingness to think of on your feet and go, okay, well, let's just hang a tablecloth up and we can make that
Yeah.
work,
Improvise,
versus
adapt, and
failing and
overcome.
walking out the door upset
Yeah.
because you didn't have a screen.
Yeah. 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 Exactly. Exactly. Uh, and to your other point, you said, well, what if you're in a smaller area, and where do you even get started? And so this is great. If you're an entrepreneur and you're in a smaller area and you want to get something started, we think about there being 4 pillars to consider when you're thinking about what's going on locally. One is, what's the available talent pool? Do you have the entrepreneurial talent? Do you have the tech talent? What's kind of the status of that, so to speak? The next is capital access. What's available on the debt and equity side? Are there venture funds? Are there angel groups, et cetera? So an assessment along those ideas. The third piece is, what's the existing entrepreneurial culture? Are there events? Are there activities? How are people getting together? We've discovered over many years now, the only way you reinforce the realm of what's possible is having this regular cadence of events that will draw people out. And you can be intentional, as they say at Google and other places, about creative collisions. And then the fourth pillar is community engagement, flagship enterprise engagement, university, community college engagement, getting those folks to understand that this is really crucial. Small business and entrepreneurial vitality is the one thing. It's kind of like the money ball play rather than trying to buy lottery tickets, which is typical economic development. Is we're going to attract in a big plant. We're going to try to attract big companies. What we do in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial ecosystems is you're taking your destiny into your own hands. What are our assets? What are our aspirations? What are the constraints? What can we do? And you can do it without building buildings or having a center or all that expensive infrastructure. Just start getting meetings and activities and people together to talk about what they're doing. I can remember more than 15 years ago, there was a coffee shop here called Big Mama's Coffee Shop. I'm not even sure if it's still there, but it was near the university. And a bunch of the sort of uh, emerging, aspiring entrepreneurs, I would say, would get together on a regular basis talking about their hopes and their dreams and what they were working on and their side hustles. And I was kind of an old guy in that mix, and we just started showing up, and that became a regular practice and it was actually a precursor to things like 1 million cups and other nationally organized things. But those sorts of meetings and gatherings are hugely important. And if you're in a small area, that's one place you can start right away. Get the people together that are small business owners or aspiring entrepreneurs on a regular basis to talk about what they're doing, figure out how to
Yeah.
help each other.
No, I think that's right. And I want to lead into a question about sort of the importance of mentorship and finding coaching and things like that. But I think you make a great point there. And I just wanted to sort of use, the example of you creating, Startup Junkies Consulting as one of the needs that you saw or that you addressed in your area was the lack of these little events. And I mean, for, a more simple term, lack of community around
Yep,
entrepreneurship.
that's right.
And so, in what is also just by coincidence a entrepreneurial move, you started creating the events, right? You started doing the things, and I think that can be sort of a model for somebody in a small town or in a community that's got a burgeoning entrepreneurial community, but it's not there yet.
Right.
Taking the initiative to go out and actually start throwing these events and start putting on things, or partnering with national organizations like 1 Million Cups or any of these types of things. You can start to not only, from a business standpoint, start to develop your name, your reputation, your, place in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and you will learn a ton from it, and you'll start to get, build a network of people, which I think is for a lot of entrepreneurs where they really thrive. But I think that just by virtue of creating those events, you're sort of doing the entrepreneurial thing. And I think that that's really important. But what you mentioned just there at the end about sort of this group of guys that were getting together at the local coffee shop, I was trying to come up with it. There's an organization here in Utah that's basically a bunch of retired ex-Fortune whatever CEOs and stuff like that, and they get together, once every couple of weeks, and they do these Zoom calls, and they'll have politicians on, or they'll have business people on, or they'll do whatever. And then they have a weekly meet. Right. And that moment of spending time with them is maybe kind of what you described, which you were the older person in the in this group. But what you brought to that group was you've got a bunch of, anxious minds or hungry minds here that are ready to do something exciting, and they've got those hopes and dreams. And then they can leverage your experience to try and figure out how to materialize those things. And so I think that then takes me back into this idea of mentorship and just how important that kind of thing is. I think, we touched on it earlier, but a lot of entrepreneurs tend to feel kind of isolated or solo,
Right.
like it's all on me to do this. And, I personally have employed coaches and worked with different people. Even this podcast to some extent is a way of networking and developing relationships with people. And, so I wonder what your thoughts are around sort of mentorship and coaching, as one sort of vertical, but then just sort of the value of community in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's crucially important, and a couple of ways to think about that. One is there's so much that can be gained from the peer-to-peer networking as well, because what you find out is all the entrepreneurs and small business owners are likely, even if they're in completely different segments, are facing similar problems, but they all have different networks, and they can all be connectors for each other. So a good degree of mentoring can come on a peer-to-peer basis, people that are kind of at the same stage. Mentoring, I like to separate mentoring also into the idea of there's mentors and then there's subject matter experts. Mentors, the best mentors for a small business owner or a startup are people who have actually walked the walk. Maybe not in that same space, but they built things, right? Mentors are not typically people who have spent their entire career in a large company. They are going to have a context of subject matter expertise that can be hugely valuable if you want to know something about that space. But you got to be really careful not to take their advice on what it takes to build the business, because they don't know. They haven't done it. They've had a legion or an army of people working with them versus being in an entrepreneurial context. So understanding that difference between mentors and subject matter experts is important. The other thing I'd say is when you seek out mentors, it's good to find people that want to help just to be helpful, particularly in the beginning. They're not looking to make some percentage. They're not necessarily looking to get paid. There's plenty of consultants and coaches that you can pay to do it, but a lot of mentors are going to want to do it because it allows them to vicariously relive that part of their life where they were an operator without having to take all the risk, but they see the value in what they're doing, right? I mean, there's a lot of people that want to engage with small business or startups just because they want to be helpful, because they remember how hard it was. So seeking them out is really important. And some of them, if they're really good and you want to have a more material commercial relationship, they won't even ask for options. But if you offer it, there's going to be a lot of ingratiation that will come from that as you think about stock options and whatnot. But it's hugely important. It's hugely important. Now, one thing I would say about that, we've been lucky enough to be part of a number of mentor-driven programs over the years. And we participate with the University of Arkansas on one called the Venture Mentoring Service, which was based on an MIT platform. We did a bunch of work around something called Mentor Camp, which brought in mentors globally to engage with high potential startups. We've got an active set of mentors and SMEs that we use in all of our programs. The thing that I think is really important about all that is for the founders to develop a really well-defined filter. And what I mean is there's an opportunity to get mentor whiplash. You've seen all these experienced people, and they're all going to give you different insights based on their experience. The best founders are the ones that can take all that input in, be very respectful, ask good questions about it, listen well, but then they filter and synthesize what the real truth is based on all those inputs. And the really good ones, and there's a guy named Ryan Frazier that now runs Arrived Homes, who's an entrepreneur that came out of here. He's running it's a large VC-backed venture in Seattle now. He was fantastic at taking in all those inputs and then filtering out what he heard and then getting back to those mentors to say, this is what I heard, this is what I learned, now this is what I'm going to do. Because ultimately, he was the one accountable to actually implement and execute and to be successful. But that's a healthy way to think about engaging with mentors and subject matter expertise and understanding the difference between
I think that's smart. And I like the distinction of trying to find somebody who walks the walks. My wife and mother are both teachers, so I come from a family of educators, and they hate this phrase, but there's this kind of ucky phrase out there that is, those who don't do, or those who can't do, teach, right? And I think that sometimes, especially, we were talking earlier about just sort of the ready availability of almost anything and everything nowadays due to the internet, that this has spun up a lot of people who actually can't do, so they're teaching. And so you've got sort of this extra
Yep.
filter that you need to look at, which is the I guess internet mentor that has spun up a course or
Yep.
done whatever, but it's not really based on anything in particular. So I think that there's a little extra
Yep.
filtering that has to be done these days. And so finding a good mentor by virtue of either having walked the walk themselves or by a good referral or whatever, I think can be a good way to do some of that.
100% agree. Yeah, 100. You have to be discerning, because there's a lot of people out there with a book or a program or a set of slides that maybe they've been on the fringe, but maybe they haven't actually done it. So
Yeah.
that's really good insight.
The next thing I wanted to talk to you about a little bit, and I have some theories about why this is, but one of the things that I think is sort of the perpetual plight of the small business person is there's sort of this looming imposter syndrome or something hanging around over their shoulder, right? Sometimes they're not that confident in what they're doing. They know they want to do it, but they don't know the way, they don't know the path. And not to focus so much on the imposter syndrome, but I think what it spins up is this activity where we feel like reading every book and watching every video and doing everything. So we do a perpetual ingesting of new things, but we never actually act. And so I wondered if you had
Yeah.
any insights or things that you could share in terms of actually making action out of the things that we've learned. And you sort of alluded to it a little bit with this example that you were just talking about, where he was able to, take in all the things these different mentor types would give him, but then he was able to apply what made sense or formulate his plan based on what he's learned.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that moment, that tipping point we get to between we've learned enough and now it's time to act. Because I think it's just a matter of fear, and
Yeah.
people kind of kick stuff down the road, I think.
No, I love that. I love that question. I love that question, and for lots of reasons. In fact, the second core value in our core values is take action. So, I mean, number one is do the right thing. The second thing is take action. We always try to have a bias towards action in what we do. And part of that is driven by the fact that regardless of how well researched you are, and it's great to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the area that you're trying to build a business in, but at some point you have to take action. You're never going to have probably more than 70% of the information you need. And you're going to learn so much more by actually doing something and engaging with the customers and taking that step than you will by continuing to be caught in sort of the analysis paralysis mode of it. Now, it is good to benchmark, and it is good to read the sort of seminal works, and it's good to be a sort of voracious consumer of information. But there's no replacement for taking action. You're going to get immediate feedback from the market by doing that. And the one thing I'll say about markets and customers is there's sort of a ruthless level of efficiency there. You find out about a bunch of stuff if you go ahead and take action. If you go ahead and launch that beta a product you have, if you go ahead and try the service, if you go ahead and put that event on, it's not going to be great. It never is great the very first time you do it. But the whole point is then you incrementally and quickly iterate and get better based on what you learn. I think that's the only way to be successful. And I'll further this response with just a little bit more. When I was at Westinghouse and I was a system engineer and a product manager, we had digital designers that would never release a new board because they were trying to get a quarter decibel more performance out of it. They've already met the requirement, but they were aiming at perfection. Life, to use a mathematical kind of analogy, is asymptotic. You never quite get there. It's always aspirational, but you have to take action or you never will even approach that level of perfection. So I mean, it's a really good point you brought up. You just have a bias towards action. Get as much information as you can and then act. And you're going to learn a ton.
No, I love that. So the last thing I want to get into just, in these closing few minutes is sort of around the notion of choosing a path. I think that there's a set of entrepreneurs, maybe not everybody, some people come from a family business. Some people have a passion that they've landed on, things like that. But I think a lot of times, and maybe this is just sort of internet culture, but we're sort of prompted to act on our passions and move on the things that are, really deep and emotional to us. And I don't think that every startup necessarily has to be that way. I think that, obviously it's good to have some,
Mhm.
at least care about what you're doing, and I think it's important to be
Yeah,
interested.
yeah, yeah,
But I think a lot of people spend, and maybe this is just one of these procrastination techniques where they spend a lot of time trying to identify what their passion is. And then the worst part, or maybe the other side of that coin, is the people who are not necessarily chasing their passion, but they're chasing somebody else's passion by virtue of, hey, I've
sure.
seen the guy with the yacht on Instagram and I want a yacht. So what's he doing? So let me chase down his path instead of, living my own life or trying to figure out my own way. And I think that's especially common nowadays, and sort of especially among young people who are up to their eyeballs in social media and all this sort of culture of wealth and things like that we put on social media. And so I think people are in this position where they're having a hard time delineating what's actually their thoughts from the thoughts of others. And so I wonder if
Yeah,
you've got any pointers or any insights. And obviously, I mean, a lot of startups probably come to you with an idea in hand. But I mean, do you have any
yeah,
thoughts either from your own experience or from people that you've met along the way where, maybe they are entrepreneurial and they do want to do a thing, but maybe it's not really their thing. And by virtue of
yeah,
conversation or coaching or whatever, they're able to actually uncover what it is they actually care about.
yeah, 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 yeah. And there's been a lot of discourse around, you know, the mythology of pursuing your passion, because sometimes that doesn't have any overlap with what a viable business can be. I mean, there might not be any intersection there. I think being introspective about what am I good at, sort of what brings me energy and what am I good at, and then the other aspect is what would people value and actually pay for. That's kind of another important part of it. Um, I think looking for that kind of intersection is important, and realizing that the business you're working on today might not be the business that you're going to work on forever. But if it's a means to an end, for winning, however you define it, and winning is seldom piling up a big stack of money. Winning is at the end of the day feeling like I had some kind of impact. This was purposeful. This meant something. This solved a problem for a customer. This had a ripple effect in a positive way to a lot of people that I didn't even know by virtue of what we did. It's not easy. There's a lot of iteration that's required to try to get there. The last thing I would say about all that is the most unhappy people I've ever met in my career are the ones who were 100% one dimensionally focused on how much money they could make. The happiest people I ever met are the ones that said, we solved a big problem and it turned out we made a bunch of money, but we started by wanting to solve a big problem that we cared about, that the market cared about, and that's how we pursued it. Guy Kawasaki, a guy who's written numerous books and was the chief evangelist at the Macintosh division, said, make meaning and the money will follow. He said that in The Art of the Start. I really believe that. And again, it's not that's what I'm passionate about necessarily, but it was meaningful. There was a purpose behind it. There was a vision that made sense. The other thing I'd say too is, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's important. A lot of people in the startup and the entrepreneurial world get caught up on the less than 1% prospect that everything has to be venture capital backed. 0.6% of all companies are actually successful in getting venture capital. There's a ton of great companies that never raise institutional VC money. They might raise angel money. They might not raise any. They might build it based on customer revenues. We should dissuade ourselves, and we should actually not even celebrate raising venture capital. Nobody celebrates getting a loan, typically. It's a necessary evil. And so I think if people focus on building a fundamentally good business that solves a problem that they care about, that people actually pay for, that's pretty good orientation. Fundamental economic thinking, figuring out how to get revenues out in front of expenses, and sustainability, and understanding your customer and delighting your customer. Those are the kinds of things that I think people need to focus on if they're trying to build something that they feel good about, and that ultimately they might make some money in it, but they're going to feel good about what they
Yeah,
did
I think
if they
that's
do
right.
that.
And I think it's a really good point, that concept of making meaning. I think there's probably some sort of just like universal human truths out there. And it's really easy for us to go,
Yep.
oh, well, you know what? I just want to make money. I just need to, I need the biggest house. I need the whatever, And so I think it's really easy
Right.
to focus on that or get caught up in that. And that's maybe sort of I don't know, an immature approach or a novice approach to business, it seems like. Because I think what you start to discover, and, this is something too that we've sort of have discovered through this show, just as even growing entrepreneurs ourselves, like nothing happens overnight. Everything is layered on. There is no shortcut. You can't just get to the end and learn something that you're going to tell me today. I'm going to have to add all that stuff on top of my layer cake. And eventually I'll get to the knowledge that I needed to do the thing I wanted. But it seems like for most people who are sort of established in business and who've been doing this for a long time, what it ends up with is something like what you're describing. I was impactful to the lives of my employees. We did something great for the community. We, made an impact globally that did X, Y, or Z, but you never hear them go, oh, well, yeah, but I also cashed out those stock options and I got that sweet Bugatti. Like it's almost never that. And so there's sort of this, contradiction of things going on in society right now, which is sort of the posturing and the flaunting and the pretending we're rich or putting off images that aren't necessarily real. The Instagram version of life where, everybody's on vacation all the time and everything seems great. And then there's sort of the reality, which is you actually don't feel good if you're doing that stuff. You'll feel much better if you're doing this stuff.
Yep.
So I think that's an interesting insight.
Yeah. Well, and again, not to get overly philosophical, but I think it was Gandhi that said, to find yourself, lose yourself in the service of others. And you can do that as an entrepreneur. And you don't have to be a social entrepreneur. It doesn't have to be a nonprofit. But if you think about, are we doing right by those clients we're serving? Are we empowering them? Are we inspiring them? Are we changing lives? That's the kind of thing that will drive you to continue with the grind, to put in the late hours, et cetera. And I think that we need to kind of get back to that. The superficiality of, how big your bank account is or what kind of car you drive, that is fleeting. And nobody's going to remember that. It's short-term gratification. But if you can point to the fact that you really did something that changed lives, that moved the needle in society, and you built a business, whether you call it a social venture or not, that did some of those things, I think that's a better orientation.
Nope, I think you're right. Well, here, Jeff, in the closing minutes, let's where can people track you down online? How could they engage with your organization if they so wished?
Yeah. So you can find us at startupjunkie.org. That's the primary location. If you want to learn more about the book, Creating Startup Junkies, there's a site called creatingstartupjunkies.com as well, or you can find it on Amazon. And if you're interested in what we do in the venture capital world, you can find us at cadroncapital.com as well. And that's and I'm all over LinkedIn all the time as well. So definitely look me up. I'm happy to help anybody.
We'll share all those links in the show notes. So well, thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate you taking the time today. This has been an awesome conversation. I think we learned a lot.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It was great talking to you, and best in luck with all your future
endeavors. Thanks so much. I appreciate you. And thanks to everybody who tunes into the show this week and every week. We'll see you guys next time. All right. It's like that.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.